This workshop is called Taking Creative Control, and it's basically just about moving on from the kind of pictures that you take with a point-and-shoot camera, or when you first buy your camera, and getting into how the camera works and understanding how the camera works so that when you take pictures, you have a sense of what they're going to look like. Okay, so why do we want to go manual? Manual's hard. You have to make decisions for yourself. You can't let the camera do the work. You have to have an understanding. It's another step above. And why do we want to go through this effort? Because cameras today are pretty smart. Well, auto mode takes snapshots, and manual mode takes photographs. And we're all photographers. And what we want to be doing is taking photographs that end up looking the way that we imagine them looking beforehand. And I think that's what a photograph is. And a snapshot is, well, we'll get into what a snapshot looks like, because here's a good example. This is a picture taken last year. This is Josh Thompson, who was our photo editor last year, and me. And this is at the NASH convention, which is kind of a student journalism conference that happens every year. Last year it was in Edmonton, this year it's going to be in Montreal. And we usually send a couple people for free with tickets, so if you're a Martlet staffer, you might end up going to this conference. Anyway, this was taken by Gemma, who's our editor-in-chief this year, and with a tiny little point-and-shoot camera. And it's just a really good example of a snapshot. Can you guys see this there? Okay. And so why is this picture a snapshot? Like, what jumps out at us as the things that make it look like a Facebook picture?
Your hands?
Yeah, that's one of the things. Let's go back and just like brainstorm a little bit here. What jumps out to you? Just throw things out there. The hands.
The cup is kind of covering your face.
Those are compositional things. Anything else? Okay, so the first one that I noticed is direct flash. This photo's taken with the flash that comes on the camera. And you can see that because the faces have no shadow. Like under Josh's chin, there would normally be shadow, but it's blocked by his chin. So the flash is going straight on his face, and that's why you can't see any shadow in the face. It's often a really unflattering light. And if Josh wasn't squinting super hard, you could see tons of red eye. So that's direct flash, and this is one of the things. And that's also why the hand's really bright. The rest of it isn't the same. Direct flash is also why we have a dark background. I don't know why it's doing that. The left side of the picture's gonna cut off, but that's fine. It has a dark background, so it's underexposed. We might as well be floating in space for all that you can see in the background, right? All the lights on the front people, and the picture hasn't been metered so that we know that we're in a bar getting loaded right now. The other thing we notice is poor image quality. This projector isn't super bright. Actually, if you turn off the lights, you can see better. The picture is really grainy. There's not a lot of sharpness or visual detail. And in the background, you can kind of see these like hazy ghosting. I've kind of cheated because I just downloaded this off Facebook, which compresses photos more. But the point of mentioning this is that oftentimes your camera on auto mode will take a JPEG picture, which is a compressed format, and manual mode lets you shoot in RAW, which is uncompressed. The last main thing is overexposure, because you notice that my hand is way brighter than my face or the background, and that's because the light isn't balanced, right? That's the closest thing to the picture, and with on-camera flash, that was the brightest thing. So there isn't a level exposure balance. And composition is the last thing, which is ironic because it's off the side of the screen. But like you guys mentioned, my hand's in front of my face. Kind of like, I think we're leaning over a little too far. And we'll talk about composition a little bit later, but that's just one of the things you notice when you look at this picture that kind of makes you think, oh, this isn't a professional photograph. So, this is a photograph that I took last weekend. It's a promo shoot for a band called Archon Legion that has an album coming out, and they wanted to do some promo shots. And this is me being a little conceited right now, but I would consider this a photograph. And so why do we think this is a photograph? Well, the first thing is that there's a balanced exposure. You can see where the people are in the background. There's framing, so you know where they are. There's even light across all of the people, so that they all kind of get the same amount of light. And I've made those decisions in advance so that I know what the photo is going to look like when I take it. The next thing is composed framing. And composed framing doesn't always mean that you set up the tripod with the camera and you tell the people exactly where to stand. That is part of composition, and sometimes it works really well. But oftentimes composed framing just means looking through the viewfinder and kind of thinking, does this person have enough space above their head, and are their arms in the frame, that kind of stuff, just to make sure that the composition is kind of balanced. And we'll talk about this a little bit later some more. There's sharpness and definition in this picture, so you can see because I've taken it with a tripod at a fast shutter speed, there's no camera shake. It's a high quality image because I shot it in manual with a high quality setting. And that really comes out in this picture. And there's directed lighting, so I've decided everywhere that I want the light to go. And I use strobes for this picture, and I think we might do another workshop with strobes when we get some more equipment in, but that's one of the things that makes this photo a photograph. So how do we take pictures like this? When we go to take a picture, we take our camera out and we look at the scene, and our eyes have a really sophisticated way of metering the light so that we get things that are overexposed and underexposed, and we can look at both of those things at once. And we don't think about it consciously as we do it. But that's all the camera thinks about. The camera's always thinking about how much light do I think I need to take this picture, and how am I going to change the settings in the camera to get that amount of light. So in order to take photographs, we have to know how our camera thinks, so we can make those decisions based on how much info it's getting. Alright, does that make sense? If you guys have questions, just throw them out, because I'm kind of just rolling along here. So there are three main things that the camera thinks about when it's trying to balance your photo, and the first one is aperture. And aperture is measured in f-stops, which is a complicated math thing, but basically the smaller the hole, the higher the f number. And this is the hole in which light travels through to reach the sensor or the film in the camera. Okay, so if you go down to 4, that's quite a big hole, right? And often lenses are determined, like how expensive a lens is determined by how big their hole can go. Because like in an f2 lens, a telephoto f2 lens, there's a lot of glass in there because the actual opening of the lens is really big. So that's one of the things to think about is when you're taking a photograph, how much light do you need in the picture corresponds to your aperture. And another thing to keep in mind about aperture is that it also affects the depth of field. So this is kind of a classic depth of field picture. You can see that the fire hydrant here in the front is in focus and sharp, and the background is totally blurred out. In fact, it's so blurred out that you can see these little green circles here, and those are called bokeh, which is like a Japanese word for blur. And that's kind of a function of a lens element, and a lot of people think that this looks really pretty, so a lot of people use telephotos for that effect. But this is depth of field, right? There's a very limited plane of what the lens can see that's in focus at one time. And the lower number that you go in aperture, the bigger the hole is, the narrower the depth of field is. And you can kind of see this if you hold your hand up in front of your face. And if you look at your hand, use your peripheral vision, you can see that things on either side of your hand aren't in focus. And if you look kind of through your hand and focus on the wall behind it, your hand gets blurry. Right? So our eyes have a certain amount of depth of field as well. That's something to think about when you're shooting portraits and stuff like that, and we'll get into that a bit later. Am I going too fast? Is it okay? Okay. So the second thing that the camera thinks about is shutter speed. And aperture and shutter speed are like the two main settings in the camera, which is why when we get into manual modes, those are the two things we'll talk about. And shutter speed is basically how fast the shutter is flipping, how long the sensor is exposed to light. And in an SLR camera, you have a mirror inside, and whatever your shutter speed is, that's how fast the mirror flips up, and it opens for a certain amount of time and then closes again. And most of the time you'll see shutter speed measured in 1 over 200 or 50. Those are all fractions of a second. Here's a good example of a use of shutter speed. These guys are fighting in a boxing ring and they're moving around really fast. And you need a high shutter speed in order to freeze the action so that there's no motion blur. Okay? Another thing to keep in mind when you're shooting this kind of thing is I was using a telephoto lens here. And if you ever look through a pair of binoculars, you notice that, if I'm looking at the room, then if I move my head around, the picture doesn't move very much. But if I'm looking through a pair of binoculars, the image moves around a lot if I move the binoculars a little bit. So the further away you zoom, the more shake there is. So there's a basic rule of thumb, which is whatever lens you're using, if you're using a 50mm lens or a 200mm lens, you always want to try and get your shutter speed at least to as high as the lens goes. So if you're shooting with a 200mm, you want to try and shoot it at least 1/200th of a second. And that really reduces how much camera shake you get by holding it. And image stabilization helps with that if you have a camera or a lens with image stabilization. Here's another kind of funny example about shutter speed. A lot of times with shutter speeds that are really high, they freeze action so well that it looks like there's no motion going on. So these longboarders are going down the hill at about 70 kilometers an hour. And if I shot this picture at like 1/3000th of a second, it would look like this guy had basically just walked on the hill and put his longboard down and stood on it, because there's nothing around him moving, right? There's no impression of speed. So what I did here was I went to a lower shutter speed, and I panned the camera like this, so that he is at the same focal plane the whole time, and he's moving at the same rate as the camera is as I pan. And the background is really blurry, because the shutter speed I have isn't fast enough to freeze this when I'm moving the camera. Okay? So that's kind of the flip side of shutter speed. Sometimes you want a slow one to show action.
Does the aperture matter when you're doing shots like that? Like what aperture would you have used for that?
Well, the main interaction between aperture and shutter speed is, the faster your shutter speed is, right, that's less time that the sensor has to be exposed to light, right? So generally, the faster the shutter speed you have, the smaller aperture number you need, the bigger hole you need to get the right amount of light, right? Because if you open the hole bigger, you can open it for a shorter amount of time and still get the right amount of light.
Okay.
That make sense?
Yeah.
The third thing that influences those other two is ISO, which used to be called ASA in the film days. And this is a measure of how sensitive the sensor or the film is. And it's measured in multiples of like, I don't know, it's like 200 or something like that. This is ISO 1600, which is about as high as my camera goes. And you can see in this picture that, like, in this guy's face, and this is my friend Mackenzie in his jacket, there are these colors here that don't really match, right? Like, look at this guy's face here. That's not skin color. There's all these, like, little red and green dots here. And that's because it's so dark in this picture that the camera is trying to kind of guess what colors are supposed to be there. And when a digital sensor is at a really high sensitivity, it's not very good at finding the delineations between these colors. So you get this digital noise that looks really bad if you blow the image up really big. In comparison, this is ISO 200, and this is a shot that we took last year about what kind of stuff you want to bring on a trip. And this is at ISO 200, and you can see even in the dark areas of this picture, like here, this black looks totally black, right? There's no different colors or pixelation here. So all the colors are really rich, and they're not noisy. So kind of the rule of thumb with these three things is you want to try and keep the ISO as low as you can, as long as it gives you the right aperture and shutter speed that you want. And we'll move into some examples here where you can kind of see that trade-off. So how do these things interact? This is the big question, right? You have these three settings you can change on your camera, and you want to know how you can change them and why you would want to change them in order to get the right kind of picture. So we'll go through some examples. This is a photo of the singer Billy Talent. We shot a concert of theirs at the Save on Foods Memorial Center last year as part of the Martlet, which was really fun.
I saw that concert, it was good.
Yeah, it was awesome. And so this photo was in a really dark room, and I wanted to freeze the action, and I needed to get enough light so that you could expose them properly. So this was shot with a 7200mm telephoto, which is a zoom lens, right? It goes from 70 to 200. And it has a really long range, so it can reach out and take pictures of particular people on stage without having to get the whole stage in the picture. And because I was shooting with a 200mm telephoto, I wanted to shoot at a shutter speed that was close to the zoom range, otherwise I get camera shake in the picture, right? This also helps because the guys on stage are moving around and headbanging, and I wanted to make sure that when this guy was singing, I wasn't going to get, blur from his tongue moving or something like that. So because it was so dark in here, I was shooting at 1/200th, and that meant that the camera was really working hard to try and get enough light to the sensor in that fraction of a second that it's open. So This lens is kind of expensive. This isn't my lens, it was Josh Thompson's lens I was borrowing. And this lens costs like $2,000 or something like that. I think it's like $200, right?
You can get them for cheaper, they're in different versions.
Yeah. Ballpark something like that. And the reason that it's expensive is because it's a telephoto zoom with a long range, but it also goes all the way down to f2.8. So this is a pretty fast lens. It has a really big iris, so it can let a lot of light in, even if you're shooting at a high shutter speed. And the other thing I had to do, because it was so dark in there, was go up to ISO 800. So I made the sensor a little bit more sensitive in order to pick up some more of the light detail. And you can't really see a lot of noise in this picture, but different cameras have different noise settings. So mine is pretty good at about 800. It's as far as I like to go. Modern cameras go into like the tens of thousands in terms of ISO and still look good, but I have an older camera, so this is what I was rocking with. Here's a sports photo. I took this a couple weekends ago, and at a soccer game, the people are moving around really fast, so you need a pretty high shutter speed. And because the field's really big, you also need a long lens, so that when they're over on the other side of the field, you can still take pictures. And it's helpful to have a zoom, so when they come closer to you, you can zoom out and still get those photos. So this is a 70 to 300 millimeter telephoto. But it's actually way cheaper than the lens that I used to shoot the concert photo, because it only goes down to f4, which is a slower, right? There's less, it opens less of a iris when it's using its aperture. So because this was a sunny day, it didn't really matter that much how fast I was shooting, because there's so much light coming out that I could shoot at a really high shutter speed. So 2500 is a really fast shutter speed. It lets me freeze things like a sod of grass that's kicked up by a player's cleat if you were zoomed in really far. And that's a really cool effect for sports. And in order to get a high shutter speed like that, the camera went down to as low as it could go in terms of aperture number, which was f4. And in this case, I forgot to take the ISO down to 200 from 400, which happens to me all the time, but the sensor difference between those two things isn't really that high in modern cameras, so it doesn't make that much of a difference between those two numbers. Here's a macro photo that we took of fruit salsa last year for a food review. And you can see in this picture that there's a really narrow depth of field here, right? Like these chips here and these chips here are out of focus. So there's kind of like a diagonal plane here where you can see the salsa's in focus and like this chip's in focus, but the other two aren't. So in order to do that, I wanted a really small depth of field, and that meant I had to have a really low aperture number, right? I had to really have a really big iris hole to let a lot of light in. So in order to do that in this room, I was shooting with a 50mm lens, which is a pretty standard kind of medium telephoto on a crop sensor camera. And because I wanted to go to 2.8, which is a pretty low aperture, I had to turn the shutter speed up to make sure that I wasn't getting too much light in the picture, right? Because otherwise I'd have, the whites would be blown out. And in this case, I intentionally went down to 200 because the difference between 200 and 400, there isn't that much noise difference, but it means that the camera has to work harder in order to get the right amount of light. So it went higher up in shutter speed because I went down from ISO 400 to 200. Does that make sense? Okay. It's hard to keep these ratios in mind when you're taking a picture, but that's something I'll come back to. So camera modes, right? There are about four different ways of controlling the camera to let you choose exactly what you want the camera to do. And so the first thing I'm going to tell you is that everything here is garbage. Just don't pay attention to that at all. These settings are settings where someone in a studio has said, okay, well if I was taking a picture of sports in a perfect world, what kind of settings would I tell the camera to shoot? And they work hard at these settings and they make sense in that particular setting, but light changes so much and the topic of what you're shooting changes so much and the color balance and stuff that these modes are never really good at getting the right exposure. And that's also partially because they take what the camera thinks it wants, and what you want when you're taking a photograph is what you plan the photo to look like in your head, right? So you can basically just ignore all those modes. The easiest one out of the real modes is the program mode. And program basically means that the camera still chooses the aperture and the shutter speed for you. So it's looking at the scene and saying, this is how much light's here, and these are the settings that I would use to take this picture. And most of the time when I have my camera in my bag, I have it in program mode, because I know I can just take it out of the bag and take a picture, and it's going to be pretty much right. It's also a handy tool to tell you what the camera thinks it should be doing, because a lot of times it's hard for you to guess the light level in a scene. Like, some really pro photographers can go to a picture and be like, okay, this looks like f5.6 at 200. And I'm not very good at that yet. So I kind of cheat by turning the program mode on and focusing, and the camera says, okay, that's the settings that I think it's at. And then I usually change to one of these ones so that I can make a decision about what I want in particular. Aperture and shutter priority do similar things. The aperture one lets you choose your aperture, and then the camera decides the shutter speed for you, and the flip side is for shutter priority. And this is like shooting that sports photo when I wanted a really high shutter speed. I can go to shutter priority and turn that up to 2500, and the camera will say, okay, you need f4. And if I'm taking a picture of food or a portrait of someone where I want the background to be blurry, then I go to aperture priority and I slide it all the way down to 2.8 or 1.8 or whatever it is, and the camera decides, okay, you need this fast shutter speed. And these two modes, the more you use your camera, the more I use my camera, I notice that I use aperture almost all the time, because I know it's hard for me to say, like, okay, well, this guy's running, I know I'm going to need exactly 1/800th of a second to catch him, because there's a lot of variance in terms of speed. And I know that if I turn this number down, I'm going to have a higher and higher shutter speed the lower I turn it down, right? So usually I keep it in aperture priority, I set it to a setting that I know looks good with the camera, and it gives me a shutter speed that I'm guessing that it's going to give. So this is kind of something you just pick up by using your camera. And other than that, I probably recommend using a program for a while just to kind of see what the camera guesses. The fourth setting is manual. And manual lets you choose everything, of course. Not that these other ones really constrain you, but manual mode is like, a lot of times when I'm shooting in a dark room, like if I was trying to take a picture in this room, I could go to aperture priority, I could go to program mode, and the camera would focus, and then it would say, I'm not going to take this picture because there's just no way I can get a good shot. Or it's going to say, I'm going to shoot this picture at, half a minute long. So like there would be tons of camera shake, and it would just be totally impossible if I wasn't using a tripod. And all of you who are sitting there, if you like scratch your nose or something, your hand would be totally blurred. So I throw that out, and I go to aperture priority, and I set it down as low as it can go, and it's still telling me that it needs a really slow shutter speed. And if I go to shutter priority and I set it to 1/60th or whatever it is, it's still going to say the aperture is too low, and I don't really want to take the picture. Manual mode is like if you're shooting with strobe lights, or you've planned ahead how bright you want the scene to be, and you want to make an executive decision, and kind of override the camera, that's the setting you use. I don't often use it, because I think I can usually guess what the camera's going to do with these two modes, but it's another one of those things to experiment with. And if you guys are wondering what ADEP is, I never use it, but it lets the camera decide a certain depth of field. And if you ever run into wanting to use that setting, I can explain it to you, but you probably won't ever, so don't worry about it. I don't ever use it. So modern cameras have a couple of other features that we have over film cameras from the days of yore, and I really like your film camera, by the way. I have this. And autofocus is probably the one thing that your camera can do way better than you can. And autofocus is like, it saves you so much time. It's like the handiest thing ever, and you pretty much use it all the time. When I look through my Canon Rebel camera, this is what I see. And there's obviously a picture in the background, not just white. But this mode is usually called one shot, and when you're looking through it, you can see these are the focus points that the camera can look at in autofocus to decide which part of the area should be sharpest. And so often when you're taking a picture, you'll be on all focus points mode. And it'll focus the picture, and it'll say, okay, there's a tree here, and a bicycle, and a person's head. And it'll take those 3 points, if they're on the same focus plane, and focus on them, and then you can just take the picture, right? But a lot of times I'll find if I'm shooting a portrait of someone, and there's confusing things in the foreground or background for the camera, I'll pick one of these focus points, like this one. If I know the person's face is here, and you can press the button on your camera and jump around to that focus point and it'll light up red. And when you focus, this is the point that's always going to be in focus, and it's going to take that focus point over all the other ones. And you can also do another thing where if you pick one focus point and focus on one point, you want to recompose. If you hold down the button, you can move the camera a little bit, and it'll still keep the same focus point. So this is autofocus, and this is like, with a modern camera, it actually is pretty easy to change it manually if you want to. But this saves me so much time in my life, and I love using it. Autofocus is like just amazing. And pretty much the more expensive camera you have, the more zones you're going to have, so that you don't have to worry about centering something in that particular spot. And one other focus mode that's really important and really cool for particular shots is called AI servo. And that basically means that the camera finds a subject and focuses on it and tracks it as it's moving across the field of view. So in a picture like this, which is field hockey, this is a field hockey tournament that happened here last year. The players are smacking the ball so hard it's flying all over the field. It's really hard to keep track of where the play is. So you're having a hard enough time aiming the end of the lens at where the game is. And if I had to press the shutter button to refocus every time I wanted to take a picture, I'd miss every shot. So AI Servo lets me hold that button down, and as I'm panning around to follow the game, the camera's saying, okay, here's this player, now I'm going to follow this player, depending on the focus mode. So it's jumping around to get the focus point. So I didn't choose the focus point here, but the camera is smart enough to know that you want these guys and not what's in the background. So AI Servo is really useful for sports. Other than that, I wouldn't really use it because it tries to keep correcting the focus, and if you're taking a picture of a portrait of someone at a particular distance, it'll keep thinking that that person's moving and trying to refocus, so that can screw you up. So only really use AI Servo if you're shooting sports, or an air show, or something like that. And white balance is another, probably the last really relevant setting in your camera that you want to keep an eye on. Post-production software today is really, really good at correcting white balance problems. So I almost always just leave mine at automatic white balance. But to kind of give you a visual of the difference in white balance, here's a really nice family picture. This shows up. Here we go. That's me. There's my family, it's my grandparents. And this is the photo that I took in my living room. And oftentimes indoors in a living room environment, something like that, you'll see that the lighting is kind of orangey, because that's just how humans often like a bit of a yellower light, a bit of a warmer light than normal. The lights in this room are fluorescent, which means they're a little bit green or blue. If I took a shot in this room with the lights on, you'd be able to notice that. So this is the shot if you took it in auto white balance, right? Here's the shot if you took this picture in incandescent. So the camera's like, okay, this is the kind of light bulb you're using in your room, and you decide that. It looks like a little light bulb, and that's a tungsten light bulb, which is usually pretty warm. And it takes that color data and it kind of edits that out of the picture. So this is kind of what, it's a weird concept to get into, but this is like the camera's ideal white, like the idea of what 100% white looks like in terms of like if you looked at the mathematical expression of white. This is based on what white looks like. So the white things in this picture are like the dictionary definition of white, you could say. And sometimes you don't want this. Sometimes it's undesirable to have a picture that looks this much white. You know, sometimes people's faces are a little more flattering in warm colors. But again, this is something you can correct in post-production. So don't worry too much about white balance. So we've mostly talked about technical things this workshop, which is fine because those things are important. But you know, if you talk to a grizzled old photojournalist, they're going to tell you that a really good photographer can take one of those plastic cameras you buy from the supermarket and take a better picture than someone who bought a $25,000 camera and has no idea how to use it. And a big part of that is composition. And composition is kind of one of those things where it's like, if you're comparing the snapshot to the photograph again, the composition is the thing where you're going to look at it and kind of be like, I don't know quite what's wrong with this picture, but it doesn't look as good as this one. and that's composition. And composition is a hard thing to kind of get a grasp on because it's not something that's immediately obvious. It's kind of something that you learn over time by looking at a lot of photographs and getting used to how photographs work. There's kind of a cheat code for composition, which is called the rule of thirds. This is a picture that I took in Bellingham of a couple signs by the side of the road that I really liked. And I kind of superimposed this grid over it so you can kind of see. Again, the projector's cutting off the left side of the frame. I don't know why it's doing that, but and this isn't an exact grid either. But you can kind of see that the rule of thirds cuts a photograph into 9 equal squares. If you guys are fine arts majors or mathematics majors, you might know about the golden ratio, which is kind of a number in antiquity that you find in nature and all over human art that, for whatever reason, just really appeals to humans. We really like this certain mathematical fraction that really appeals to the human eye. And the rule of thirds is based off of the golden rule. And it's kind of a way to help you avoid framing things in the center of the picture, because those photographs are often kind of jarring or bland to people. And again, it's one of those things where we don't quite know why, but that's just kind of how it goes. So you can see in this picture that I've put the horizon line on the bottom line here, and that the top line is kind of cut in half between the middle and between the top and bottom of the skyline in the frame. And you can also see that these signs are kind of roughly aligned with the 2 vertical lines here in this picture. So a lot of cameras have a mode where you can superimpose this grid over your viewfinder, and it's kind of just a handy tool so that when you're taking a picture you can think about, does this person have enough space on every side? Are there are there arms and legs and stuff in the frame? Am I cutting anything off? Am I leaving enough space? And am I making sure that I'm not putting the thing that I want to focus on right in the middle of the picture? And rules are made to be broken. You know, you're always going to run into something where you want it to be in the center of the picture. But this is kind of just something, one of those things that kind of helps you with composition. So, I've been talking for a long time. What should you take away from this workshop? Basically what you'll take away from this workshop is a couple of things. The first one is, think about and compose every photograph you take. Don't take snapshots. If you go to an event where stuff's going on, and things are exciting and a lot of stuff's happening, it's hard to resist the temptation to take your camera out and just start shooting pictures. And that's fine, you know, like you obviously want to get as many pictures as you can in case you come up with something really cool. But this just means that every time you put the viewfinder to your eye and you're about to take a picture, you kind of just look through it and think, is the light bright enough here? Do I want it to be darker or lighter? Have I thought about the composition here? You know, have I thought about the depth of field? You kind of just make sure that when you take this picture, when you go home and look at it on a computer, you're not just going to be like, okay, well, here's a photograph of the river, and then keep going. You want it to be like, wow, this is a really well-crafted picture, because I thought about it as I was taking it, and it's a real photograph, and I would put this in my portfolio, or whatever it is. So that's one of the main things, is even if you take none of the technical stuff away from this workshop, just every time you take a picture, think about it before you do it. And the other thing is, taking more pictures makes you a better photographer. I've been shooting pictures for 4 years. I don't still consider myself that great, but the only way that I really got better, even though I read all these books and stuff, was by going out and taking more and more pictures every day. And that doesn't mean, you know, that I carry my camera around with me and shoot pictures all the time, though if you like that, that's awesome. The Martlet's a really good way to get involved in shooting things that you want to shoot, like concerts and sports and stuff like that. And just the more time and effort you put into it, the better you're going to be at it. So, just like anything else. Right? The third thing I want you to take away from this workshop is that I'm a resource for you, right? I'm the photo editor. If you guys want to shoot stuff for the Martlet, if you want to shoot concerts or sports, if you want to do pictures of people, you know, like portraits, you know, I'm not a genius or anything, but I'm here to help you guys so that I don't have to run around taking pictures all the time of stuff, because that's not really my job. I don't want to be the guy who's going and taking all the pictures and being like, look, this is my newspaper, here are all my photos in it. I want to be like, look, this is the team of people that I got together that are working with me and we're learning from each other to fill this newspaper with, you know, a lot of people's great photos. So if you guys have any questions, I'm always available by email, or you can call me, you can come into the office. A lot of times during the week I'm there. And if you see something on the listserv that you want to take a picture of, let me know. I'm really happy to come with you on a shoot if you're nervous about it. I can take pictures too in case you're worried that you won't get anything out of it. And I'm always here to work with you guys and stuff. So that's it pretty much. I think I went over everything I planned to. Yeah, questions?
I'm sometimes a bit confused between, I play a lot with aperture priority and ISO, but sometimes I'm wondering if I should also adapt the exposure in the menu, and like turn it down one
Okay.
like -1 or +1. It's something I don't know if I should play with that or not.
For sure. That's something that I forgot to add.
Yeah.
It's something I meant to add. I was working on this presentation really late. There's another setting in your camera called exposure compensation, which kind of looks like need a whiteboard marker. It looks like a line with a bunch of points on it, and you're usually centered in the middle of the picture, like this. And there's like a big square here, or triangle. That's a triangle. And exposure compensation is a tool that you use usually in program mode to tell the camera, okay, here, say if you were shooting at like 1/200, and let's say 5.6. These are just arbitrary numbers. This is like, you focus with the camera and it tells you that's what it thinks you should be taking this picture at. But without going into aperture priority or shutter priority, you can still make a decision that affects the camera's brain by saying, okay, well, I like your metering for this picture, but I think it's a little bit too bright. So I'm going to go down a half stop or a quarter stop or whatever your camera decides, and you're going to put this triangle here instead. So now the camera's going to go, okay, well, it kind of tricks it into thinking that the photo is actually brighter than it is. So the camera's going to go, all right, well, if you're going to go down there, I'm going to go to, 1/50th and f4. So if you don't want to go into, it's a good way to start using a manual mode because you're still in program and the camera's still telling you what it thinks it should be taking a picture of in terms of metering. And if you're looking through the viewfinder or you take a picture and you look at it and the photo looks too bright or too dark, you can play with this line to fix that stuff. This also works in the aperture and shutter speed priority modes, although I never use it. But if you were in aperture mode and you decided that you wanted it to be f4, that you were locked at f4 and you wanted to take this picture at f4, and the camera's metering it at like 1 or 100. That's what the camera thinks the shutter speed should be based on that. And if you drop one down, it's going to say, okay, well this is too bright, so I'm going to go to 1/50th or 1/25th or whatever it is. But most of the time, you could get the same result by just moving this up a notch, if that makes sense. And the difference between 4 and 5.6 isn't really huge, depending on the lens you're using. But this is a good tool to get a slower shutter speed, or a higher or lower aperture or whatever, based on the setting that you already have in the camera. And this mode is disabled in manual because the camera isn't really metering for you there, and you can change these two settings without asking the camera, without trying to trick the camera into a different brightness. Does that make sense? Still a little confusing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just kind of.
I'm just wondering if you do you play a lot with that? Because it's something a bit longer, you need to go in the menu and play around with it. I guess if you're in.
I don't find myself using it that much because I often find that if I'm in aperture priority mode and I want to shoot at f4, but the camera's telling me 100 and I don't want to shoot at 100, I just go to manual and I turn the shutter speed up or down.
Okay.
Which I find is often faster. Another thing you can kind of do with it is, like, if you're taking a picture in program mode and you just want to see what the picture looks like a little bit darker, you can roll it down one just to see what it looks like, and take that picture. And if you're unsure what the right exposure is for a picture, because sometimes a photo looks too bright or too dark, a lot of people will bracket, which means they'll take a picture here, and then they'll take another picture here and another picture here. just so they have those three so they can decide which one they want. And in computers nowadays, sometimes you can actually map those pictures on top of each other to get a balanced exposure. But that's a little over the head, I think. You really don't need to do that unless you are really curious about it.
I think some cameras now have auto bracketing too. It'll take 3 pictures at once.
A lot of cameras do have auto bracketing, yeah, like mine has auto bracketing too. And that's really handy if you want to do HDR. You guys have heard of HDR before?
Yeah.
That's when you take 3 photos at different bracketing settings, and then in post-production, in like Photoshop, you can layer those photos on top of each other so that a really dark picture and a really bright picture, you can meld them so that the areas that are overexposed here and underexposed here, they kind of come into the same picture. Let me see if I have one, I can show you actually. These kind of photos are widely derided as a little bit corny because a lot of people like to go really overboard with the settings that they take on them. But they do look kind of cool. And a lot of times this year, or last year, we had shots that were like, take a picture of the athletic building. And I was like, that's probably the most boring picture I can imagine. So I shot them in HDR to kind of cheat into having a more interesting shot.
For compositing the pictures together, do you have like a specific program you use?
I used one called Photomatics Pro, which is like, I think it's like $14 or something.
Yeah.
You can do it in Photoshop too if you have more like Photoshop skills, but I don't really use Photoshop, so.
Because I tried to do it in Photoshop and I got like the dark and the medium, and then when I put the light one on, it kind of screwed it up. So.
Yeah, I have no idea how to use
Pretty well in
Photoshop.
Yeah,
But ask
I
a
think
ninja higher rank than me. In case you guys are curious, this is a picture that I used to do all the photo editing. This program that I used to do all the photo editing. It's called Aperture. It's made by Apple, and it's a raw editor program. So Photoshop, a lot of the time, when you take a picture and you want to make edits to it, it's adding code to the picture to be like, okay, well, this area is too dark, and I'm going to make it brighter by adding brightness on top of it. And the cool thing about modern cameras and shooting in RAW mode is that those cameras are like, when you take a picture with RAW, it's like auto bracketing. It takes all the information the sensor can grab at once, and then when you change the brightness slider in a program like Aperture, it's actually changing what the picture actually looks like, rather than adding or taking away.
I think Lightroom.
Lightroom is
does
the
that
same
too.
thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the same thing, made by Adobe. It works on both Macs and PCs. Aperture's only for Macs,
Yeah.
just because
But like
It's not really
works on 10.5 or higher, I think. So.
yeah. Anyway, this is an HDR picture. You can see that like these areas that would be really dark. The sky is a good example. The sky is underexposed here. You can kind of see how, on the computer at least, you can see that there's cloud detail that you wouldn't be able to see if it was exposed properly. Yeah, sure. And the picture also looks super vivid because it has 2 layers of color added to it. And so if you go on Flickr and look for HDRs, there's like a billion pictures of people shooting carousels in HDR that are like so eye-bleedingly bright that you look at them and you're like, the colors are too real. And so a lot of photographers make fun of HDR because they think it's ugly. If you're tasteful about how you use it, it can be a really helpful tool, but it means you have to drag a tripod around you everywhere so that you can shoot 3 pictures in the same exact framing without moving the camera at all, because otherwise you have to fix it in post-production. And one of the artifacts you kind of see with HDR is like, if you look around these towers here, or any of the areas where there's a contrast, there's kind of this haloing effect. You can see that? How there's like this bright edge?
Oh, yeah.
So that's another kind of artifact you see in HDR.
I had a question about the picture you took like at the start of the presentation of the band, the front guys. What focal length did you use for that?
That's a great question. Let's go look it up. Another cool thing about the photos that I use and the programs that I use is that they have exif data, which just means I can look at any picture and it'll tell me what settings I was at when I took it. So I was shooting at f3.5 and at 200 shutter speed. These guys are all on the same focal plane, right? Like their heads are all at the same distance from the camera. So I can use a pretty low aperture and still get them all in focus. The other quirk, though, is that I was shooting with a 17mm lens, which is a really big wide angle.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
And that's something I didn't mention, which is if you're shooting with a wide angle lens, the depth of field is a lot deeper than if you're shooting with a telephoto. And this won't really matter unless you have a camera where you have multiple lenses and you're switching them, but it's a thing to keep in mind. So when you're shooting with a telephoto lens, it's going to blur the background a lot more than a wide angle lens. So this is a really wide angle lens, and it doesn't really matter if the background isn't blurred because it's a small room. And there's only a couple of feet behind them before they go. Any more questions? Cool. Alright, well, thanks for coming. And I hope you guys got something out of it. I videotaped this and I'll put it on YouTube or something like that in case you want to watch it again later, I don't know. This is also stuff you can just find on the web by Googling it if you figure out what After does or something like that, just look it up. And I'm always available for questions, if you want to come by the office or something. There should be another lister about, not this Thursday because we don't have a paper, but next Thursday I'll send out an email saying, these are the stories we have for this week. And yeah, if you see anything cool that you want to shoot, let me know.
And then do we just email the pictures to you?
How does that work?
As soon as the listserv comes out, if you see something you really want to shoot, email me right away. Because then I'll kind of be like, alright, well I know this person's shooting this, and I don't have to worry about it. And I'll hold it for you so nobody else tries to get the assignment that you have. And then once you've taken the pictures, the earlier you can get them to me, the better. A lot of times if you're shooting in RAW, it's hard to email them because the photos are really big. Right, so you can come into the office with a thumbstick if you want, or there's websites like Dropbox where you can upload stuff to the web and I can download it. Thumbstick is really the easiest way if you want to just come by the office. It also gives you an excuse to drop by and say hi. We can talk about the picture and how things went. And often if you took photos and you want an opinion on them, I'm in the office a lot and I can sit down there with you and we can go over them and I can say, can make suggestions on this might be better, or look at your framing here and things like that. It's something I've done with a couple other volunteers this year that has worked out really well. Yeah. Don't be intimidated by the office. A lot of people come to the office and they're like, oh, I don't want to come in, like people are working really hard and I don't want to interfere or something like that, or think that we're like super intelligent nerds, or I don't know. The office is a really chill place. We hang out there and drink soda and sleep on the couch and stuff. It's a cool place to come and do your homework if you want to. And if you come to a couple, I think it's like 3 meetings, then you can vote on the paper meetings for what the cover's going to be and stuff like that. So that's a really cool opportunity to get involved. And if you want to be staff photographer next year or photo editor, if you come to a couple of meetings and make yourself known so that we know who you are, you're more likely to get hired next year. So that's a cool setup too.